Craig Gilbert. Craig holds a BA degree in history from Yale University, and he has covered national and state politics for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel since 1990. He has written extensively about the electoral battle for the crucial swing states of the upper Midwest, and today he will discuss the 2016 election and tell us how it has deepened the long-standing divide between the parties in some ways and is altering those dividing lines in others. He will also explore the fault lines in Wisconsin where both presidential candidates are struggling to break through the voters. We look forward to your presentation, Craig, and we have made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way of saying thank you. And as usual, we will be having questions at the end, and there'll be microphones that will be floating in the audience. So please wait till you get to one of those to ask your questions. So please, let's welcome Craig Gilbert to the podium.
I heard it. I got it. Thank you. If I end up making news like your last speaker did, then something has gone terribly wrong. My name is Craig Gilbert. I'm actually the Washington Bureau Chief of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. I've been with the paper for a long time. Most of the first 10 years, I worked for the Journal and the Journal Sentinel. I was the political reporter based in Milwaukee. And for almost 20 years now, I have been based in Washington, D.C., but continue to spend a lot of time following the endlessly fascinating politics and extremely distinctive political culture of our state. I spent a lot of time a couple years ago on a project called Dividing Lines, which examined how politically polarized Wisconsin was, and particularly southeastern Wisconsin, the degree to which people were not only politically divided by party, but politically segregated, living overwhelmingly in either very red or very blue neighborhoods. In Dane County, it's overwhelmingly in very blue neighborhoods. But the interesting thing about Milwaukee was there was very little in between. Very few people live in purple communities, but lots of very, very Republican places and very, very Democratic places, and places that are getting more so. They're getting further apart as time goes on. So now here we are in 2016, and it's a timely occasion to talk about these issues. We are coming on the heels of the first presidential debate, apparently the most watched debate in presidential debate history. And ironically enough, since we have the two most unpopular nominees in history, people still can't get enough of this race. And then we have Donald Trump, one of those nominees, coming to Wisconsin today. In fact, I'll be at his event in Waukesha County later today. And that brings to mind some of what I wanted to talk about today. It's interesting that Donald Trump is coming to Waukesha County. If you look at a map of Wisconsin, you saw in the polling before the Republican primary back in April an interesting pattern we found, that Donald Trump had his worst numbers among Republican voters in the most Republican part of Wisconsin. That dark area in southeastern Wisconsin, the darker though it shaded, the more unpopular Donald Trump was with voters in his own party in Wisconsin. In fact, he had his worst numbers in the very most Republican counties in the state, Waukesha, Washington, and Ozaukee, and he had his best numbers in that green area, which is a large and politically diverse area, but it's pretty much all of northern and western Wisconsin. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, when we got to the Wisconsin primary, that's exactly how people voted. The red areas are places where Ted Cruz won, and the redder they are, the better Ted Cruz did, and the green areas are counties where Donald Trump won, and the greener they are, the better Donald Trump did. So the county that Donald Trump is visiting today, Waukesha County, he lost by almost 40 points to Ted Cruz. I mean, I don't know if you can find another Republican county in America where Donald Trump did as badly as he did in these three counties outside of Milwaukee County: Waukesha, Washington, and Ozaukee, which, by the way, are three of the best performing Republican counties in America. In fact, Waukesha County, where he's visiting today, if you look not just at the share of the vote in 2012 that voted for Mitt Romney, but if you look at turnout and you look at the percentage of all legally eligible voters who not only turned out but cast a Republican ballot, Waukesha County was the best performing Republican county in America, the best performing county for Republicans in America. And yet Donald Trump is struggling, and he struggled there terribly in April, and he's still struggling there today. It's hard to get numbers for a single county in Wisconsin, but if you aggregate a lot of polling over the past several months by the Marquette Law School, it looks something like this. In the presidential race, in a four-way race since July, Donald Trump got 41% in Waukesha County, Hillary Clinton has 27%, and Gary Johnson has about 10%. There's about 15% undecided. So he's below 50% in a county where Republicans are normally at 65 or 70%. And he's only about 13 or 14 or 15 points ahead of Hillary Clinton for that reason, because there are so many undecided Republicans. That's about half the lead that Ron Johnson has in the Senate race in Waukesha over Russ Feingold, which is what you would more typically expect to see out of Waukesha County. My newspaper is now owned by the same company that owns USA Today, and we're in the middle of a project, a collaborative project, where we picked 8 counties around the country to look at how different kinds of counties with different politics and different demographics were performing in the presidential race, what voters were saying. And I kicked off this series with a look at Waukesha County because I think it's interesting as a microcosm to some degree of how Donald Trump is doing with the Republican base. It's not as bad for him in all Republican counties as it is in Waukesha, but the fact that that voters there have taken so long to coalesce behind him, to some degree is a demographic thing. I mean, he's done better with blue-collar voters than he's done with college-educated voters, and Waukesha has higher than average college education. To some degree, it's a political thing. It's very conservative voters who are evaluating a candidate that hasn't been a typical traditional longtime conservative. And then you have local factors like his clashes with Scott Walker and Paul Ryan and his opposition from conservative talk radio in the state. So it's just an interesting pattern. It's something that is an obstacle for him to overcome if he wants to compete in Wisconsin. Both candidates have their issues in their party bases. I mean, Hillary Clinton obviously had a tough campaign against Bernie Sanders, and there are parts of the Democratic coalition that aren't very enthusiastic about her. Not all the Bernie Sanders voters have come around, but she, in a state like Wisconsin, she has been getting more of the Democratic vote than Donald Trump has been getting of the Republican vote. And so he's really, in effect, trying to kind of rewrite the Republican map in Wisconsin. There's some interesting regional patterns. The green represents the 2012 race between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, and the orange is 2016. And everything above the center line is a Democratic advantage, and everything below is a Republican advantage. So those first set of bars, those tall bars, are the city of Milwaukee. And what that tells you is that the Democratic lead in the city of Milwaukee is bigger this time than it was 4 years ago. So Donald Trump is doing worse. He's losing by even more in the city of Milwaukee, a very Democratic area, than Mitt Romney did 4 years ago. And that second set of bars is the rest of southeastern Wisconsin, which is a pretty Republican area. That includes Waukesha and those counties, and counties like Sheboygan. And 4 years ago, Mitt Romney had a lead of about 14 or 15 points in that part of the state. Republicans typically win that area by 15 or 20 points. Yet he has no advantage right now in that part of the state in recent months because of what I've been talking about, because of the reluctance and the struggle that some Republican voters are having in making a decision in that race. The third set of bars is Green Bay, and Donald Trump is actually performing better than, it's the Madison market, and there Donald Trump is not losing the Madison market by as much as Mitt Romney was losing the Madison market 4 years ago. And then you have Green Bay, where Donald Trump is doing much better. He's got a nice lead of 13 or 14 points in the Green Bay media market, where Mitt Romney was pretty much at 50-50. And then finally, everything else in northern and western Wisconsin, where Mitt Romney was losing 4 years ago, Donald Trump is winning by a little bit. So basically, Donald Trump is underperforming in the metropolitan Milwaukee, which is obviously the most populous part of the state, but he's overperforming in the rest of the state, particularly in northern Wisconsin. So you see this kind of urban-rural divide. It's a big divide in our politics between the two parties. It has been for a long time, and it's been getting wider for a long time. The more densely populated the community is that you live in, the more likely you are to be a Democrat. The less densely populated, the more likely you are to be a Republican. Some of that is demographics, but even if you control for things like race and age and income, you still see that population density matters. Where you live matters in terms of how you vote. I also looked at Dane County and Waukesha County as kind of examples of base counties for both parties. And you see a little bit of a difference here. In Dane County, Donald Trump's actually running third behind Gary Johnson by a point or two. Both well behind Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is not where Barack Obama was 4 years ago. She still has a big lead, but she doesn't have his level of popularity. But the interesting thing, again, is that Gary Johnson is, if anything, slightly ahead of Donald Trump in the polling since July in Dane County. Obviously, Gary Johnson is drawing more of a younger demographic, but he's also getting, the votes of some potential Republicans. He's taking some votes away from Hillary Clinton and some votes away for Donald Trump. But you still see Hillary Clinton with an advantage in Dane County like you would expect, but Donald Trump's advantage in Waukesha is not nearly as dramatic, so more of a fall off there for him. Why does that matter? Because swing voters matter in an election, but so do base voters. And both parties have figured out that they can win elections in part by running up the score on their own turf, by generating massive landslides by turning out their base. And so this is an example from 1984 of the biggest counties in Wisconsin. And at one side you have Milwaukee and Dane, the blue bars, and those bars just represent the raw vote margin for the presidential candidate in that party. And over at the other end you have Waukesha. That was 1984, and this is 2012. So that just shows you the difference in the landslide vote margins that the parties were generating from their base counties back in the 1980s and what they're doing now. And the importance of those counties to each party has grown, partly because in the case of Dane and Waukesha, they've grown in population, but also they've grown in turnout and they've become more lopsidedly Republican. Dane and Waukesha are two of the 5 highest turnout counties in America. Wisconsin is a super engaged place. And southeastern Wisconsin and southern Wisconsin, you have some extreme examples of that. I mean, there are parts of city of Brookfield 4 years ago, 90% of the legally eligible people, citizens of voting age, voted. 90%, that's almost universal turnout. There are parts of the country where it was 30% or 40%. Wisconsin was number 2 to Minnesota. Minnesota's always number 1. Wisconsin's always number 2. I once heard the term the civic responsibility belt to describe the upper Midwest, and people have different theories about, ancestry and how the political culture develops, but it's not just voting. I mean, you can find a lot of different, look at this club and your membership. I mean, a lot of different ways of measuring engagement and participation, and Wisconsin tends to be at the top, near the top of those lists. So people vote like crazy, and Dane and Waukesha are great examples of that, but it affects statewide elections. I mean, just Dane County by itself, I mean, Milwaukee County has always generated big margins for Democrats, but Dane County has become more and more Democratic and more activated, just as Waukesha County has become more and more Republican and more activated. I mean, you can see in the history of each of these places how our state and our country has become more polarized over time. I mean, it wasn't all that long ago that you were represented by a Republican congressman. Herb Kohl, Tommy Thompson won Dane County one year when he was running for re-election as governor, which is kind of hard to imagine now that a Republican could win Dane County in a big race. He won Milwaukee County more than once. Herb Kohl won Waukesha County one time when he was running for re-election. It was a one-sided election, but still, it's hard to imagine that happening today. So, you know, we're as polarized as ever, but the fault lines in some ways are a little bit different, and you saw in the Republican primaries some of these divisions come to the fore, particularly over Donald Trump. This is just a map of Wisconsin, red and blue from 2012. And again, it's another reminder of why all this matters, because it's that southeastern part of the state outside the city of Milwaukee that is the most Republican part of the state, where so many of the Republican Party's votes come from. So in the case of Donald Trump, it's an issue that he's at his weakest among Republicans in the most Republican part of the state, in the highest turnout, most politically engaged Republican part of the state. If that depresses turnout at all, it makes it harder to win statewide elections for Republicans. If he loses votes to Hillary Clinton and/or Gary Johnson, that makes it harder. Just as Hillary Clinton has to hope that she can come close to replicating the turnouts that Barack Obama had and the margins he had in places like Dane and Milwaukee, that will be a big part of the story in terms of how Wisconsin votes for president in November, along with the battle for the much swingier parts of the state, which tend to be in the northern and western parts of the state. Wisconsin's unusual in that it's very competitive. Its rural counties are very competitive. The battle for the rural vote is very competitive in Wisconsin. That's not true of most states. So you have, in southwestern Wisconsin, those blue areas along the Mississippi River. So that whole southwestern corner of the state where it's blue, the only place you see that outside of New England is southwestern Wisconsin, southeastern Minnesota, and eastern Iowa, the upper Mississippi River Valley. And you almost see that nowhere else in America outside of northern New England. So it's an unusual part of our political landscape and our political culture, and it's part of what makes Wisconsin a competitive state, because Democrats, in order to win elections in Wisconsin, they have to compete for rural voters. They can't afford to lose them by the margins that they lose them in most other states. And so that's Donald Trump's strength in some ways. And it's also not just Donald Trump's strength that he's doing well with rural voters, but it's Hillary Clinton's weakness. You know, one of the challenges in sort of analyzing this campaign for people like me, I mentioned that these are the two most unpopular nominees in the polling that we've had in modern polling, in terms of the percentage of people that have a positive view of them and the percentage of people that have a negative view of them. They're both underwater. Donald Trump a little more so than Hillary Clinton, but it's very unusual to have two such unpopular nominees. And so, you know, you might read accounts at different points in the campaign about Hillary Clinton surging or Donald Trump surging, and you really don't know whether it's because they're becoming more popular or their opponent is becoming more unpopular. I mean, Donald Trump is not fantastically popular in northern Wisconsin or the Green Bay area. He's actually underwater. But Hillary Clinton is more unpopular in those areas. And so that's what it's about in some cases. That's what it was about in Monday's debate. It was about both candidates are going to have to win the votes of some voters who don't like them. I mean, 4 years ago, 5% of the registered voters in Wisconsin disliked both candidates when it was Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. 5%. Today, it's 25%. So 5 times as many people dislike both candidates. And the number of undecided voters, not surprisingly, is 2 or 3 times higher. In fact, it actually grew from last fall when you did head-to-head matchups of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. It was smaller a year ago, and it was smaller 6 months ago than it was this summer or since the nominations were wrapped up. So it actually grew. It's starting to shrink again, but it's amazing that it would grow because it normally gets smaller over time as people make up their minds. So a lot of reluctance, a lot of hesitation, and it is a really stunning attribute of this campaign that we're going to elect. I'm going to wrap up soon because I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but we're going to elect the next president is going to come into office almost certainly less popular than the president who's leaving office. You keep seeing these wrong track numbers of 60 or 70%, the number of people that are really unhappy with the direction of the country. But the thing to remember about that is that there are people in both parties that are unhappy. It's not necessarily a referendum on one party or the other. People with both parties are unhappy. We have divided government. The parties can't agree on anything. It's frustrating for people in both parties. Barack Obama's at 50% or 51% or 52%, which is pretty good for him. But people in both parties are unhappy. Republicans are unhappy with Barack Obama, and Democrats are unhappy with the Republican Congress, and everybody's unhappy that nothing's happening. That next president is going to go into office. This is a depressing thought, but they're going to be considerably less popular than the president that's leaving office. And there may not be much of a honeymoon. For one thing, unless Donald Trump wins and the Republicans hold the Senate, we're going to have more divided government, which is a source of frustration for everybody. But barring that scenario, we're going to have more divided government, and we're going to have a president taking office who's more unpopular than popular. So anyway, on that cheery note, I'm going to invite you to take questions, and I can field questions on this race, on past races, on politics, on the media. I've covered politics for a long time, almost 30 years, and a lot has changed in both the media and in politics during that period of time. So we can talk about any and all of that.
Craig?
Yes.
Craig, if you thought you were going to get out of here without a prediction on who's going to win the Wisconsin Electoral College votes and the Senate race, you were wrong.
Okay, well, I mean, this is easy in the sense that I don't make predictions. I'm not going to tell you flatly what is going to happen, but I would tell you that, and this is probably not news, that Hillary Clinton, is legitimately the favorite to win Wisconsin, and Russ Feingold is legitimately the favorite to win his Senate race. I mean, every public poll has shown Russ Feingold, for a year or more, has shown Russ Feingold leading in Wisconsin and has shown Hillary Clinton leading in Wisconsin. But it's close, so you cannot say with absolute assurance what the outcome is going to be. But it's very unusual in my experience to have an uninterrupted string of polling showing one thing, and then on Election Day. Now, we could get more, if we get more polls before Election Day showing a different outcome, then it's a different story. But if every poll that's taken before Election Day shows one outcome, it would be unusual to have it work out the other way on Election Day. That's just been my experience. It's not about whether any individual poll is right or wrong, but you always have to look at polling. Never put too much stock in one poll. Look at polling in its entirety, and then that tells you a story and gives you a picture. I did something last week on for Ron Johnson, especially if Hillary Clinton holds her lead in Wisconsin, for him to overcome that, a defeat for Republicans at the top of the ticket, he has to obviously outperform Donald Trump. Now, that can happen, and it's happening in some states. It's happening in New Hampshire for the Republican Senate candidate. It's happening with Rob Portman in Ohio, Marco Rubio in Florida. Right now, it's not happening in Wisconsin in the public polling. They think they're going to outperform Trump. They're very confident of that, the Johnson people are, but it's not, you don't see it yet in the public polling, and so that's an obstacle for him to overcome. If the presidential race turns out that way, he's got to win ticket splitters. And right now, there's just as many people splitting their tickets and voting Trump-Feingold as there are splitting their tickets and voting Johnson or supporting Johnson-Clinton. And so it's a little more unpredictable because of how many undecided voters there are and how many people there are who are going to vote for third-party candidates at the top of the ticket. But that's kind of where we are right now. Yes?
Hi. Frank Stein. I like your very calm type of manner at a time when everybody is just up and down. I have a question regarding the impact of endorsements of newspapers. People don't read newspapers as they did.
Right.
The newspaper circulation is going way down. I noticed the New York Times on Monday came out with a very strong endorsement of Hillary Clinton. Now, your newspaper is now owned by a syndicate, the USA Today. Is your newspaper going to have an endorsement of any of the presidential candidates?
Actually, I'm not sure. Since we do have this sort of wall, believe it or not, between the editorial side and the reporting side. So I don't participate in that process. I'm not part of the editorial board. Sometimes reporters will sit in on the meetings with the candidates to write news stories, but we don't participate in the deliberations. we've gone back and forth like some newspapers about whether to make endorsements at all, and I've actually kind of lost track of what our current policy is. So I know for a while we made endorsements, and then for a while we stopped making endorsements. So I can't honestly tell you, that would be a question for our editorial page editor, whether we're going to make an endorsement or not. I just don't know. I do think, I don't think they have tremendous impact. I think particularly, if it's the New York Times endorsing the Democrat, that's going to have less impact than, I think there are some newspapers in Republican areas that have been traditionally more Republican that have endorsed Clinton. That might have more impact. I mean, I've never been sure how much influence that actually has. Newspaper readership is down. Certainly the printed paper readership is down, but online it's not, it's up. So some of these things can be read widely, in fact, beyond their local readership, which wouldn't have been true in the past, but that doesn't mean that they have an impact.
Craig, thank you for coming today. Wonderful talk. John Bonsettville. I'd like to invite you to please speak for a moment about the legacy that President Barack Obama has given our country in his presidency.
Well, I'm not going to express a value judgment about his legacy because that's not my role. I think it's interesting that he's ending on an upswing in terms of public opinion. He's had some downswings, certainly, and you can talk about his public policy legacy, and obviously, I don't know how he'll be judged by history. I mean, obviously, you have the judgments people will make about the healthcare law. You'll have the judgments people will make about how his presidency handled the financial meltdown of 2008 and what that meant for the pace of recovery for the rest of his presidency. Those are big items. Certainly foreign affairs, there's a lot of vigorous debate about the foreign policy legacy of this presidency. And then there's also the political legacy. I mean, he's had a successful presidency politically in the sense that he got reelected, but it hasn't been all a bed of roses for Democrats below the top of the ticket. And so his political struggles and the debate over the stimulus and the healthcare package in 2010 led to what we may look back on as the most important election of our lifetime, which was 2010. Because 2010 not only elected most of the governors in America, but it was a redistricting year or redistricting cycle. So it meant that in states like Wisconsin, when one party came into power, they could rewrite the political lines and the district lines. And so in states like Wisconsin, it led to not only a one-time changeover in power, but it led to a more enduring changeover in power, which obviously has had dramatic public policy effects in Wisconsin because Republicans were very effective once they came to power at holding power, not only Scott Walker's success in his reelection campaigns and his recall campaign, but in drawing the map the way it was drawn in Wisconsin, which makes it all but impossible for Democrats to win back the legislature in anything but a massive landslide election, and those don't really happen anymore because of how polarized people are. So yes, so you can look at his success at the top of the ticket, but Republicans have had a tremendous amount of political success at the legislative level and in races for governor during his presidency as well, which is also in some ways not surprising because there's kind of a cycle in our politics where one party's successes breeds the other party's successes. And we have two parties that have gotten very good at winning different kinds of elections for a bunch of reasons. I mean, the Democrats, for demographic reasons, partly, are winning presidential elections and have the upper hand on the Electoral College because the map favors the Democrats right now. Republicans have to win more close states than Democrats to get elected president these days. And so that's why I think Democrats have won the popular vote in 5 of the last 6 presidential elections. But because Democrats tend to be more concentrated in urban areas, it makes it easier for Republicans to win congressional and legislative races because their vote is more efficiently distributed across more districts. That's just the geography. And then you add into that redistricting, when you have success in midterm elections where the electorate is smaller and more conservative, the Republican Party is advantaged in these other races. And when Democrats keep winning presidential elections, it makes it easier for Republicans to win the off-year elections because there's the voters in the out party are more motivated. So that's kind of a built-in mechanism for divided government. which in our polarized political culture means kind of paralysis. But all those forces are working together to produce the same outcome. So that's also part of the legacy.
Yeah, Dave Baskerville, about Bernie Sanders, what is the Clinton campaign strategy for using him both in Wisconsin and nationally, henceforth through November?
Well, I think we're going to see him. I don't really know exactly what the strategy is and how much they're going to use him. I think both President Obama and Bernie Sanders can be an asset in certain places. I mean, they'll both be used, I think, in targeted ways. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, actually, Barack Obama's first joint appearance with Hillary Clinton was going to be in Green Bay, Wisconsin. But I believe it was the massacre in Orlando that happened just before that event, which caused them to cancel it. So as a result, neither one of them has campaigned here in this cycle. Bernie Sanders, in a state like Wisconsin, where he won and has been popular in the polling, you would think would be an asset, particularly in parts of Wisconsin like this area where he did really well. But it wasn't just this area where Bernie Sanders did well, so he could be an asset, certainly. You know, she's getting about 90% of the Democratic vote, but some of the Bernie people were not Democrats, they were independents. And so if you just look at the Bernie Sanders people, it's not 90%, it's something less than that. So he was, from the point of view of the Clinton people, a real trooper during the convention in endorsing her the way she did, even though the endorsement came late. And the Bernie delegates at the convention were divided. I mean, there were Bernie delegates that were, they called them Bernie or busters. I mean, they were just, you know, you saw them it was funny, in the convention hall at one point, I think it was on the last night when first Leon Panetta, and then there was a retired general who was speaking for Hillary on the last night of the convention. And there were these scattered chants of no more war from the Bernie delegates. Not a majority of the Bernie delegates, but enough of them to be heard, because they just hated being in that room and hearing this Marine general talk about taking it to the enemy, and hearing Leon Panetta, who had been the director of the CIA. And then you had the Clinton people, oddly enough, the Clinton delegates trying to drown them out with chants of USA, which is a chant that you typically hear at a Republican convention. So it was, and then you had the majority of Bernie people just kind of sitting on their hands because they weren't going to chant USA. And they didn't want to be rude to the Hillary people and chant no more war. So it was just a bizarre scene inside the convention hall, but kind of tells you something about those divisions on the Democratic side.
Craig, thanks so much for these fascinating insights. I'm Jeff Bartell. I assume that the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel is considered mainstream media, and I'm interested in your assessment of Donald Trump's derision of and threats against the mainstream media. Will that have any effect on reporting and editorial policy?
I don't know. I mean, there's been I think this gets at an interesting debate that's going on about journalism and about coverage in the mainstream media. I mean, the media now is so balkanized and so fragmented, and you have a much bigger kind of left-wing media and right-wing media than you used to have, and then you have the distinction with the mainstream media, which is the more traditional media, is that whatever you think of whether we're biased or not, our sort of sense of our mission is that we should not be biased and that we should be sort of neutral in the battle between the parties, for example. Whether we achieve that perfectly or not is you know, that's for readers to decide, but it does affect how you do your job when that is your sense of purpose, and that is the sense of how you should be doing your job. But it also introduces an interesting debate, and we saw this debate about Lester Holt's role in the debate. I did in 2004. The Milwaukee Journal and MSNBC sponsored a debate in Milwaukee at Marquette in the Democratic primary. So I was actually on the debate panel with Lester Holt, and we had a great debate that was televised nationally between the 5 remaining Democratic presidential candidates, and it gave me a really interesting feel for the internals of a debate, and I thought he did a good job in the debate, because I think there was some challenging of the candidates, but he largely let them talk to each other, which is really what you want, I think. But there is this broader debate about, you know, are we just chroniclers and stenographers, or are we the referees? And then how aggressive are we in those roles? And so you are seeing, I mean, just in the New York Times, it's interesting, the language that they've used has changed over the course of the campaign, where they have been more, I would say, bold in their language about, descriptive language about Donald Trump than they were a few weeks ago. They've used the word lie in some cases, which is a pretty hard word to use if you're a journalist, because you're not only saying that something is false, but you're saying it's willfully false. So it's a kind of language that journalists have traditionally stayed away from in the context of a campaign, but this particular campaign has created a more vigorous debate about these issues than in the past. And so, you know, that's, I think that's for everybody to judge as they follow the media.
Thank you so much for your time today. My name is Mark Friday. I have a question about the Northwest area being Trump supported. I also know that there's a lack of broadband and internet access in those areas, and we know that this current governor kind of has a disdain for public education. The more educated we become, the more inclusive we become, the more open we become about different ideas and cultures. Do you see in your evidence any of that impact of the lack of broadband in the Northwest area, keeping people uninformed, having limited access to the internet, might impact their way of voting?
I mean, I haven't looked at that, and I don't know if the data exists to look at that. By the way, I'm told this is the last question, but so I don't really know the answer to that question the way you framed it. But there is, you know, there is kind of a urban-rural thing that goes on. The suburbs have been kind of a battleground, particularly inner versus outer suburbs. Increasingly a battleground between the parties. Again, you can oversimplify, but you know, urban areas have become increasingly Democratic, and rural areas in much of the country have become increasingly Republican. And you know, it's an interesting debate about why that is, and whether people, and also just the whole debate about where Trump is drawing his support, and how much of it is people who are in areas that are struggling economically, and how much of it is other issues that have to do with sort of race and identity and immigration. That's a big debate. But I can't really speak to the question you're asking, because I don't know if the data exists. It's so hard to sort through, to kind of connect the dots between the information people are getting and consuming, and then how they're voting, and also what the relationship is between those things. I mean, you've seen studies that say, you know, people who watch Fox News are much more likely to believe certain things, and people who listen to NPR are much more likely to believe certain things. But is that because of the information they're getting from those places, or is it because if you're a Republican, you're gonna watch Fox News, and if you're a Democrat, you might be more likely to listen to NPR? We don't even know what the, you know, causal relationship is between those things. So it makes it hard to know. It's obviously, you know, I think there's a belief on the part of many people that part of the problem, part of the reason we're as polarized as we are, is because people are just tuning into the information they want to hear. And we live in these information silos, and that's very plausible. But we don't know exactly what's going on in that respect. So, all right. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. This meeting is adjourned.